Hello, once again. This is Pastor Phil Fernandes of Trinity Bible Fellowship, and today we're going through Bible survey, and we're on the book of Exodus, the second book from of the Bible. Remember, the first 5 books are the Pentateuch, or the Law of Moses, or the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. We talked about Genesis, the book of beginnings, and now we're in the book of Exodus, the exit or departure, and so. Remember, each nation was worshiping their own false god, and then God chose Abraham, and from him raised his chosen nation. So Israel would be Yahweh's nation, the chosen nation of Yahweh. If they obeyed their God would bless them and prosper them and make them more powerful than any other nation on earth. If they disobeyed their God, then God would raise up the pagan nations to conquer them. And but the world would see that, look, the God of Israel is not a local God. He's the God who created the heavens and the earth. Now, what happened was, after Joseph rescued the Egyptians through the famine, they were given the land of Goshen in Egypt. The Jews were hairy, bearded shepherds, and the Egyptian leadership, they had their slaves watch their animals and their herds, and the Egyptian royalty were neat freaks, and they'd bathe several times a day and stuff. So they just gave the Jews, the Hebrews, the land of Goshen, and it was good for raising flocks, and they recognized the debt that they owed him. But eventually a Pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph and didn't know the debt that the Egyptians owed to the Hebrews, to the Jews. And so the Pharaoh was afraid that the Jews were multiplying and they were more numerous. They were going to become more numerous than the Egyptians. And so what he wanted to do was first enslave them, make their work harder and harder so they wouldn't revolt, so they wouldn't overthrow the Egyptians. And then eventually he said, well, you got to take your firstborn son and drown him in the Nile River. Well, the book of Exodus is the exit or departure of the Jews from Egypt. It's God delivering Israel from Egyptian bondage through Moses, God's appointed leader. Now Moses, he was the firstborn son, but he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. Moses' mom didn't want to kill him. She put him in a basket, put it in the Nile. It floated down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter had her Moses taken, fell in love with him, and adopted him, and then raised him in the Egyptian courts. But his family, his mom and his sister, were able to work with him and help raise him and kind of be his nanny. And so as he grew older, when he was 40, he was probably a great military leader, according to Hebrews, a man of renown. But he killed an Egyptian soldier for beating up a Jew, and so he killed the Egyptian soldier, and then was wanted for murder and had to flee to the desert for 40 years. So the Jews rejected him as their leader. Over that 40 years, Moses became the meekest man who ever lived, a very humble man, and no longer given to outbursts of anger, though that did catch up with him later on in his life. But God called Moses to lead Israel. He spoke to Moses from the burning bush, and God identified himself as Yahweh. So out of the many Elohim, the many gods, there was only one true infinite creator God. All the other gods were only functionally gods or metaphorically gods. They weren't literally God. There's only one true God. But now Elohim, the one true creator God, has identified himself as Yahweh, the I am who I am, the eternal one who is in covenant with the nation of Israel. So he speaks to Moses from the burning bush. Moses goes back, but Pharaoh refuses to let Israel go. God has Moses and his brother Aaron bring 10 plagues on the Egyptians, where the water is turned into blood, the plague of frogs, gnats, flies, livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and then finally the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, where the Egyptian households, God told them, take the blood of the lamb, the Passover lamb, a lamb without blemish, a lamb with no broken bones. If Jesus' ankles had been broken on the cross, he would have been disqualified from being the Passover lamb when he was crucified on the Feast of Passover. But they take the Passover lamb, and they take the blood. They would eat the Passover lamb in a Passover meal, but the blood would be applied to the door, and the angel of death would pass over their house for judgment, so their firstborn son would be spared, whereas the Egyptian firstborn sons would die. Then Pharaoh lets the Jews go. His own son was killed, and so he lets the Jews go. But as the Jews were leaving, the Pharaoh changes his mind. His warriors coming on chariots started catching up with the Jews and forced them down, and they had to cross the Red Sea. But God miraculously parted the Red Sea. The Jews went across on dry land. And then when the Pharaoh and his armies went after him, God closed up the waters and wiped out the world's most powerful army at that time. And so now Israel is moving towards the promised land. They've been set free from the Egyptian bondage. And so Israel travels to Mount Sinai in chapters 15 through 18 in the book of Exodus. You have the bitter water becoming sweet miraculously. God gives the Jews quail, small birds, and manna, wafers from heaven. And God provides water miraculously from a rock for Israel. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, tells Moses, you're working too hard, you need to delegate authority. So he chooses 70 judges over Israel. And then God gives Moses the law to Israel, the 10 commandments that summarize all the Old Testament commands. The first 4 deal with God. Don't worship other gods. Don't bow before idols. Don't misuse or take God's name in vain. Keep holy the Sabbath day. Focus on God on the Sabbath day. Otherwise, ancient man would have worked 7 days a week. They didn't know anything about the 5-day work week back then. And so those first 4 commands was man's relationship with God. The last 6, man's relationship with his neighbor. Honor your parents, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie about others, and don't don't covet your neighbor's property or your neighbor's wife. And Jesus summed up the whole law. The 10 Commandments sums up all the Old Testament laws in 10 commands. Jesus summed up the 10 commands in just 2. Love God with everything you got and love your neighbor as yourself. With the law of Moses, the eye for an eye meant that the government, not people, didn't justify revenge. That's how the Jews misinterpreted it. Jesus had to correct them in the Sermon on the Mount. But eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth meant the punishment had to fit the crime. That means if somebody commits murder, you don't give them a 2-year prison sentence. Capital punishment for first-degree murder. But it also meant if somebody steals an apple, you don't cut off his hand. So eye for an eye, tooth for tooth means the punishment must fit the crime. God gives us moral and civil laws in chapters 20 through 24, and the ceremonial law. The civil law would be punishment for crimes. The ceremonial laws were symbolic and fulfilled by Christ. This is why the Jews are no longer under the diet, and Jesus fulfilled the feast days, and even the tabernacle and the temple, later on the temple, all pointed forward to Jesus. God gives the instructions for the Jews in chapters 25 through 40 to build the tabernacle, which was like a tent. The tent of meeting is a portable temple that they could take apart and meet. And God was leading the Jews through the Shekinah glory cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. There's the temple furniture, the feast days, the animal sacrifices, all point forward to Jesus, who would be the ultimately worthy Lamb of God who would take away the sins of mankind. Now, as Moses is up on the mountain getting all these instructions, the Jews said, hey, we want to worship a God. Let's worship our God, Yahweh, but worship him the way the Egyptians worshiped their God. So Aaron, Moses' brother, said, okay, give me your gold. And they fashioned together a golden calf and worshiped the golden calf. Now, it's interesting. They called the calf the God who rescued us from Israel. They called the calf Yahweh. So they weren't worshiping or trying to worship a false God. They were trying to worship the true God in a false way. So there's two ways to commit idolatry. One is to worship a false god, to love anything at all more than you love God. That's idolatry, to worship a false god. But if you try to worship the true God in a false way, that's also idolatry. So now, whatever the case, the Jews, Moses has to pray that God doesn't wipe out the Jews, and they're moving towards the promised land. They're on schedule to get there. Within that generation, things are going to go bad, but next we'll pick it up at the book of Leviticus. God bless you. This is Pastor Phil Fernandes, Trinity Bible Fellowship. By the way, you can go to Amazon.com, my Old Testament survey, lecture notes. For probably about $6 or $7, you could pick it up if you want. It gives you the verses and the outlines that I'm teaching from. But whatever the case, if you want to reach us at Trinity Bible Fellowship through snail mail, it's P.O. Box 3264. That's 3264, Bremerton, Washington, 98310. That's 98310. Or you can look us up on philfernandez.org or sermonaudio.com/IBD. And listen to our messages there. Please subscribe to the Phil Fernandes Show. God bless you, everybody.